Okay, well, welcome to our webinar on jumping worm management. As you know, I'm Deb Haliba, your Extension Master Gardener Program Coordinator, and I'm really thrilled to have Maryam here with us today. Before I turn the mic over to Maryam, I'm going to go over a few quick housekeeping items. First, if you can make sure that that your mic is muted during the presentation, that would be wonderful. I'll be helping with that if we're experiencing any background noise. As you know, this session is being recorded for future viewing, and I will share the link to the recording to the listservs within the week. We have an hour with Maryam today, so we will plan to end right at 1 p.m. And thank you for all of the wonderful questions that you asked when you registered for the webinar. Maryam will be answering those, but if you have an additional question, just type it in the chat. We'll hopefully have some time at the very end to get to those, okay? So now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Nouri Aiin has studied jumping worms at the University of Vermont Department of Plant and Soil Science for over 7 years with Joseph Goris. In fact, jumping worms and looking at biocontrol strategies for these earthworms was the topic of her doctoral dissertation. Her research has led Maryam to become very acquainted with jumping worms as she studied their phenology, population ecology, population genetics, and potential biological control approaches. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Maryam. Thank you for coming.
Hi, thank you, Deb, for the introduction and inviting me. Thanks for everyone for joining. So I'm going to go through all of your questions. Do you see my screen or do you see the little video boxes on top?
Oh, we see your screen.
Oh, perfect. Just wanted to make sure. So I'm going to go through the questions first. And then if you can, please take notes if there is anything unclear or if you have any questions. Take a note of the slide page and your question, and at the very end, we can cover those. So to start with, there were a lot of questions about identification. How to ID jumping worms at different life stages? What is their actually life cycle was included in those identification questions. Like when the cocoon start to hatch, when to see the adults, when to see the juveniles. So I have this slides only for future if this presentation is going to be available to you, but I'm going to explain their life cycle over this graph. Their cocoons are year-round in the soil. There's a big portion of them that are usually viable during even summer, but most of them, they hatch in March, April, and then as you can see, there is a reduction in cocoon numbers, and then again by the end of summer, when the adult earthworms, they start to produce more cocoons, the number of cocoons goes up. They start to hatch in March, as I mentioned, but they're so tiny that usually it's really hard to find them. But by the end of June, early July, they are large enough to be detected, and the peak number of juveniles is usually there, which is right now in Vermont. And by the end of July, maybe this year even actually a little earlier, because we've had warmer weather, but by the end of July, you can see the first adults, and the biggest number of adults are in early September. So what here in this slide we need to remember is they hatch in March. Peak juveniles are in end of May, June, and depending on the weather, right now it was like mid-June and the early July, which is now. So it could extend a little bit. And the number of adults is at peak by early September. Also, you won't see any jumping worms after December until March. They die. They have annual life cycle. So maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when we got a lot of cold winters with so many frosts, they died by the end of November. But this year, I found even some of them alive in January, but nothing after that. So, how they look. This picture is jumping worms adults and also their casting, as you can see here. They have three different life stages. One is cocoon. These cocoons are from three different species that we have in Vermont. We have Amentis tokiwensis, Amentis agrestis, and Metaphyre hilgendorfi. I'll show you the pictures of adult worms in the next slide, but the smaller one is this one, Amentis tokiwensis, and those two are Amentis agrestis and Metaphyre hilgendorfi. The juvenile stage doesn't have any part that you could identify them with. So almost all of earthworms juveniles, no matter what the species, they look very similar. It's really tough to ID them. The only way that we could ID jumping worms, hatchlings, and juveniles is there is an area that you have jumping worm infestation there. So you know where you're going. That's one thing. By looking at which part of the soil they are, jumping worms during March when they start to hatch, they're usually in the leaf litter on top of the soil between leaves, or if the leaves are dry, they are on topsoil, so they don't really burrow too deep. Maybe that would help to ID the juveniles. And adults, by their clitellum, you can identify them, and they're very distinct compared to other earthworms. It's closer to their head clitellum, and it's their reproductive part of their body, of their life cycle. So in general, how to identify earthworms, they have to have all of the reproductive features completely developed to be identifiable. For many earthworm species, clitellum is the part that is really important. So for jumping worms, it's very clear. If you see them once, you won't miss them. The size of worms is different. Some of them are larger depending on the species, some are smaller, but still the body shape, how they're very muscular compared to other earthworms. They move exactly like a snake. They're very strong and fast compared to other species. And this is not only for jumping worms, but some earthworms, some other species, they do it, but for jumping worms, it's very common. Like, as you can see in this picture, the tail is here. Whenever you just bother them, you irritate them, they drop their tail. This is their defense mechanism. So by doing that, they could mislead birds or predators. So the head and the main part of the body could escape, while the bird or the predator could looks for the tail. So one question was about juveniles whereas hatchlings. Hatchlings are very tiny, really tough to see. Well, you have to search for them. That's actually more accurate. Uh, they don't have any, look, there's no feature. It's only a worm and without anything on it to identify them. So they're very similar to, but they're very similar in almost every earthworm species. But when this picture is from a worm right now, a jumping worm, this is probably 2 months and a half old. So now they're much longer. Their gizzard is visible usually. Like, don't mistake that with crouton. That's not the crouton, it's their gizzard. And again, they don't have anything else to ID. So, and like we've been working with a lot of collaborators in different states, and they usually send their juveniles to us to confirm their identification. Sometimes we can, sometimes we have to run their DNA to ID them. And still people like send us, like, even if they are experts and they've been working with worms for years, they still send us other species of worms when they are juveniles. So it's still, it's difficult to identify them. So the species we have in Vermont are these three species. Amentus tokiwensis is the smaller one. They are almost 1.1 to 4.9 inches. Amentus agrestis is the medium size, and Hilgendorfi is the largest one we have. This picture of Hilgendorfi is the ventral part. So the back side of the body, the dorsal color is very similar to the other two. But unfortunately, I don't have a better picture. And also, the other thing I wanted to show, Hilgendorfi, they have two very tiny genital marking here where I'm showing, but it's really tough to see again. So compared to the other two species, Hilgendorfi is much easier to ID. When you know jumping worms, it's easier to ID compared to the other two. Amentus tokiwensis is the most abundant one that you can find them in the woods, in gardens. Agrestis, same, with just a little less compared to tokiwensis. And Hilgendorfi is the least common, but they are there. They probably, why they are less common, it might be because of their large body size, they need more resources. They might be easier to be detected by predators. So it's just probably harder for them to survive. And okay, here I wanted to show you some videos. First one is common earthworms. Well, actually, that one is an identification key. Common earthworms in Britain. And the reason why that would work for us is because most of the earthworms we have here, they are from Europe. And if you know how to ID them, you probably, if the worm you find doesn't match any of those worms in those identification key, then you have a higher chance to have jumping worms. So let's see if I can show you so this is the ID key. The link is going to be in the presentation for whoever wants to use it in the future. Oops. Sorry. Okay. So there are different species, black-headed, like these are very common here too.
Oops, I think we lost Maryam.
Okay, can I share now, or I have to be host?
Yep, you should be able to share. Sorry, folks.
Okay. I don't know where I was.
Let's go to the why don't we just go to the videos, and then we can we can have people take home those resources, the ID. Does
Okay.
that sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
What happened here? Okay. So the videos. Penny Miller, she provided me with this videos of different earthworms. This one is a European earthworm. You can see the clutellum here, and the movement is very slow. It's really different from jumping worms if you see them. And then here, it's a jumping worm, juvenile. So look, the body is very shiny. You really don't see those segments. And if you touch them, they move very fast. And also she tried to make jumping worms do the jumping movement. Look at that. Yeah. So these are different ways to ID them based on their movement and let me get back to the movement, color, and also if you know other earthworm species, then it's much easier for you to tell which species they are. This is Penny again. She put this slide together. These are different earthworms that have been reported on iNaturalist. This side of the slide, on the right side, these are earthworm species that have been reported as jumping worms, but they are not jumping worms. Look at, like, for example, this one. If you look at that flat tail, jumping worms, they don't have that. That's a lumbricus species, and that's like orange clutellum. That's not a jumping worm. And the other one, all of them. And then on the left side, you can see all of the jumping worms. All of them, they have that whitish clutellum, and that's a smaller one. That is most likely a tokyoensis. This one, if you like pay attention, that those, it seems like two people, they were holding it hands. It might be a Hogendorfi. That's the largest species we have. So if you see the adults, it should be easy for you to ID them afterward. Are they pests? Well, in gardens, we haven't really had any report that they kill plants, or in our experiments and research, whatever we've done, they really don't kill plants. They do change soil structure, their casting. It might hold too much water, or it might make soil drier. And so it's just basically changing the soil physical properties. It's the same for gardens, nurseries, and farms. And the reason that they don't become a really big issue because we constantly keep adding like mulch, nutrient, compost to this type of settings. But in forest floor, they change the soil physical properties, so they increase erosion. And then when they consume the leaf litter on top of the soil, that means that habitat for different species that they rely on, that habitat is gone. So that's why they are recognized as forest pests. And we really need to do our best not to spread them to the forests. Next is prevention and control. So there's so many questions about how to manage them, how to prevent them, their spread, how to prevent them to coming to uninfested areas. And there's some questions about eradications. There are few of them I'm going to answer here, and then the rest of them, they will be in the following slides. Like this question, can other earthworms outcompete jumping worms in soil? according to some research, it seems like jumping worms can outcompete other earthworm species. But still, if you don't have an earthworm species in your property, you really don't want to introduce a new one. So that may not be the best option to take. Is there any how to be sure that commercial bag compost don't have jumping worms? Commercial bags, they may not. It's usually when the compost, mulch, and those kind of products, they are infested, is when the compost or mulch from a uh, compost company goes to a middle person and they store like compost next to mulch, next to like wood mulch, next to leaf mulch. And when they are all next to each other, it's very easy for the worms to move around, and most of the infestation happens there. Compost bags, I can't guarantee, but most likely no. You can definitely see the worms, but the cocoons are tough to see, so that requires an expert to look for you. Does tea seed work, and what's the amount needed? Tea seed, as many of you might know, is a fertilizer. It's being used in golf courses. In golf courses, I don't, according to what I've read and all the literature they have, they don't even mind pouring pesticides into golf courses because the only intention there is to keep the turf beautiful. But do we want to do that in our garden? I don't want to do that. I think it's it's irresponsible to do that. And the problem with tea seed is tea seed as a fertilizer, it's not supposed to kill anything. So if someone tells you that they use tea seed and it gets rid of the worms, that means they use an amount that is not on the label, which is illegal because it's toxic to amphibians, to fishes. If it gets to underground water, it could be really dangerous. And it just circles back to the food chain because there are birds that feed on some amphibians. So by just trying to get rid of worms in a tiny spot in a garden, it could affect so many species negatively. And what is the amount needed? I don't know. I don't really know. But I would say don't use anything higher than what the label says. Prevention. So the most important part for prevention is that means you don't have them in your property and you want to prevent bringing jumping worms to your property. So how they come to your property is through horticultural media, including plants, compost, mulch. When you buy plants from nurseries, early season, it's tough. It's really tough to tell if there is a worm in the pot or not. But later, like let's say from actually even now towards the end of the season, when you buy a plant, if you take the plant of the pot, usually the worms are inside. Sometimes they just fall off. And if not, their casting is very visible and you most likely will see the worms in them. And if you don't have those worms in your property, don't purchase that plant. Or if you really want it, you can bare root them, wash the root, and then repot it in clean potting mix, let it establish, and then move it to your garden if you need to. There's so many nurseries that they have the worms, but it's a really hard thing to ask them to get rid of them because it's really tough. And so the best thing is for us to, if we don't have them, just keep an eye and not to buy those plants or propagate them yourself. Also, when you if you move like in between properties that have worms and don't have worms, you can move the worms, not actually the worms, mostly the cocoons with shoes, with tools and a lot of like little stuff. So cleaning between uninfested area and infested area is really important, just to show you how easy it is to move the cocoons around. Take a look at this picture and tell me if you don't have to tell me, but just note if you can see anything that looks like a cocoon. And this is a picture of a cocoon. It just looks like soil particles. And then, so almost impossible to see them, right? And then here in that little tiny spot, here is a cocoon. And here is another one on a leaf litter. So they're very difficult to really see them and make sure that you're not moving them. The only way is to clean the soil of shoes, tools, plants, everything. So establish a cleaning station for shoes, boot brushes is a great idea that you could use. You can power wash equipments if you need to move the stuff around, tools mostly. If you have the worms, like for the nurseries, I would say it's probably a little too much to ask them to have worm-free products, but they can tell people that they have worms. So if someone doesn't have this worms, they won't introduce them to their properties. But if someone has the worms already and they really want to have a plant and there is a risk that there might be a worm in that pot, I would say just you can, like, maybe you can just buy it. But if you don't have the worms, avoid buying plants from nurseries that they have jumping worms. The other important thing is when you have horticultural waste, like leaf mulch, any like throwing plants into the woods or anything, that's the part that is really important to be very mindful of it and responsible. Don't throw anything in the woods because that's how they start to establish. And usually most of the infested areas that we see are by the edge of forests where gardens are. Just by throwing maybe only one plant with some soil attached to the root, you can introduce the population of jumping worms to the forest. And for the worms, even one cocoon could start one population because they are parthenogenesis, so they don't really need sexual reproduction. One worm could produce, could start a new whole new population. Also, maybe if you really need to get rid of compost, best way is usually to compost them on site, like in your own composting bin, or if you can talk to some of these compost facilities and ask them if they could take care of them for you. How to adapt to having the worms. So one thing about the worms is like keep an eye on their when you have them, it's really hard to get rid of them, to eradicate them. So constantly monitoring and managing population is really important. Taking it like finding plants that are less susceptible to jumping worms, even if we honestly don't know which plants are really susceptible to worms. But if you think you have a plant that doesn't really do well in infested area, try to find other species and maybe keep an eye on the root depths of different plants. Plants that they have shallow roots, they might struggle more because these worms are usually occupying the topsoil, and that's where the most of soil disturbance happens. So maybe in those areas that you have a lot of worms, you can plant something that has a deep root. Also, keep an eye that adapting to these worms doesn't really remove the fact that you won't get rid of these worms, and in maybe in long period of time, there might be some other issues that we don't know about them yet with the worms. So monitoring and constant management is the best way to adapt to them. How to manage them? The most practical way is solarization. Is eco-friendly. You're not pouring pesticides or any chemical into your soil, so no harm to the ecosystem, and it does kill the worms. You have to raise the soil temperature above 104, maybe keep them at least for 2 hours in that temperature. It will kill both worms and the cocoons. So, but it's really important how you do it, because if you have a big pile, the worms, they usually they burrow deeper and they go to the cooler part and they survive. But if your compost pile is a little flat and it gets a nice even distribution of heat, it's that is more likely to kill the cocoons and the worms. Leaf litter are so the other way is during spring in March, when you have the cocoons, they start to hatch. They usually, all of the babies, they are in the leaf litter. So if you can collect those leaves early season, maybe bag them, keep them somewhere safe that they don't get out. And then when you get like heat, like today, you could solarize those bags of leaf or even the little of topsoil that where they are. And by doing that, you would really control the population. When we talk about this, it doesn't mean that you will still find the worms. It doesn't mean that you're going to eradicate them, but what the goal is to keep them, keep their population as small as possible, so we don't spread them. We reduce the chance of spreading them around. And then shallow tillage, there are some research that they say shallow tillage works to reduce earthworms population, but I'm not sure. Personally, I'm not sure about this. I haven't seen much effect with that, but if someone wants to try it, that's an option. Mulch, organic material, that's what they usually feed on. So, and also it's not only the feeding part of it, is the humidity and moisture that mulch usually provides for them. It's a great habitat and shelter for the worms. So if you can avoid those, your worms are going to be a little less happier. You still will have worms. It doesn't mean that you are starving them. They still find food, but they may not be as robust and healthy when you have mulch and organic material for them. This picture, you can see like how plump, I would say they are. Like these are very happy worms that they are, they've been like, they had constant moisture, they had organic material to feed on. This is from one of our experiments. But in the forest where they don't have as much food and they go through like cycles of a little dryness and moisture, they're much skinnier than this worms. So that's one way. Pea seed meal could be a way. Maybe like liquid fertilizer might be more helpful in feeding your plants if you have the worms and you have a really high population. And the other thing that you could do, there was one question that how to bring worms to the surface. One way is to use mustard flush, the mustard powder that you could buy them from grocery. You can mix it with water, and we can provide the ratio if anyone wants to try it. But some people might be allergic to it, so please be careful if you decide to try that. But on the other hand, this mustard flush is probably really good method for lumbricus species, not jumping worms, because they burrow like 1 meter or 2 meter deep into the 1 meter to the soil. So you can't really dig that much to get rid of the worms, but these worms are on top. You really don't have to look too much for it, to dig too much to find them. They're easier to find. But mustard flush is still, it's an option. One method that could be used is you could like, actually it's probably after solarization, this might be the best method. When you weed the garden, earthworms in general, they don't like vibration in soil. So when you weed the garden, it produces really tiny little vibration in the soil, and that causes the worms to come to the surface and start to like uh, move on the surface. So that's when, like, along with your weeding, you can collect them. If you don't like killing them, you can just have them in a bin with drainage hole and add your weed to it and let them compost, break down all those weeds for you. At the end of season, bag everything and then use it as and solarize it. Make sure everything gets heated very well, and then you can use it as a fertilizer next year. Their body is full of nutrients that are great for plants. So that could be an option. Actually, that's a great option. I'm a big fan of that. And I'll show you a picture of how to do that bin. Oh, here it is, actually. So Penny Miller, she tried this method. She made the bin with drainage hole, and she actually went another step, which is great. Just put the bin inside the soil so it doesn't really get too hot, and it keeps her worms, all of them, in the beans during the season. And at the end of the season, they could be, because the worms are dead by November, December, right? So worms won't get out of this bag. You can just bag them and solarize them whenever you get some heat next season. I wanted to show a video of like how easy it is to find them on top of the soil for the question about mustard. So here is like, it's my garden. This is how easy you can find worms. Like, you don't really have to dig much. They are on top of the soil, and that's it. Just wanted to show it that. And so you probably don't even need mustard to do that. Here, this is a really nice solarization system that one could make, but it might be too expensive. But temperature here, it gets really hot. That bucket and all that plastic that were there, they melted. Whatever you put in this, they're gonna die. So this is a way. Actually, probably the biggest factor, the most important, is having that layer between the soil and this black tarp or shield that they put. That helps a lot with increasing the heat. Compost solarization. This is the pile that I told you that it won't work, but it should be a little flat. And also, if you have the compost, on bare ground, still, even if it's flat, it won't heat up. You have to have a barrier. You need to insulate it from soil because soil temperature doesn't really heat up as easy. So one thing that we did, I think Joseph put cardboard box, cardboard boxes on the ground to make an insulation between soil and the compost pile on top of it. And then you can cover it with clear plastic. Make sure all of the edges they are sealed and they get heated. Maybe so you can probably, if there's cocoons in the middle, they may not get as much heat. So maybe get a good heat round and then rotate it because the cocoons won't move. So you can bring them to the surface and kill those. So solarization is really important how to do it. The insulation part and covering it with clear plastic is really important. Also, I think Penny tried that method to have her compost bags in wheelbarrow, and in that way you could heat everything up because it's completely separate from soil surface, and it heats up perfectly. So that's another way. Few notes about these worms. They're not suitable for vermicomposting. They first of all, they won't just stay in a compost bin. They get out. They're annual species. That means 4-5 months of the year you won't have these worms. And also when they are babies, the first 2 months, they don't really do much. So they're not good for vermicomposting. Even if they were not invasive, they're not good earthworms for vermicomposting. So most of the control strategies that you probably see, like if you see anyone tells you about like chemicals, they're not, they are for sport fields, the turf that they use a lot of pesticides there for different reasons. So they're not really great for gardens and places that we are trying to bring life to them. And the other one is maybe like you probably should have your own IPM, best management practice toolbox. Solarization is a way, collecting, hand picking them is a really good way, and not feeding them, not introducing them. So that's the best way to do it. And also, even if we find a way to control worms, it won't be practical. There is no pest control that is practical to be used in every different setting because they always come with their negative impact. So if there will be really a method, effective method to specifically kill jumping worms, it would be used probably for nurseries. But in gardens, I don't think any control measure could be used. And also, like during when early life stages, they are way more susceptible. So if you can collect them, maybe solarizing them early as spring is much easier to kill them when they're not as robust compared to the adults and as fast as adults could escape from heat or any or from you when you try to pick them up. That's the best time to actually manage them. And also, if anyone wants to use any chemical, please make sure you read the labels and don't go over the labels. And then we get to the last slides. There were a few questions that they were not really, they didn't fit into identification and management. So what concerns about buying plants from retail or box store, uh, yes, many of them they have the jumping worms. So if you don't have the worms in your property, be very careful to check them, ask the people in the nursery, uh, and make sure you're not introducing them. That's the only way. And I'm sure it's really because at the nurseries they have to keep watering their plants, they fertilize them, they add organic material and mulch. So it's the best habitat for the worms. And most of the nurseries they have them. It's unfortunate, but it's a fact. So I think this one we talked about it. About new developments, there's so many research going on right now. There are some people in Minnesota. We are working, collaborating with people from Minnesota, Wisconsin, different places, but everything is at research stage. None of them are recommended yet, not even to the nurseries, not even to the commercial uh, settings. So they're pretty new. We're working on them. And the thing is, whatever control measure you have to, like, you do, it has to be repeated. That experiment has to be repeated between different states, different time of the year, and you have to make sure it works. Like, if I run the experiment this year on juveniles, I have to run it exactly same time on juvenile. So everything, if it works or if it doesn't work, it takes years. And the other reason is these worms are annual species. They're not like aphids that you can have constant population of them and run experiments. So yes, there are research going on, and but not much yet to be recommended. Uh, People who have experienced crop production. There has been few people that they said they might have, but then we talked about it. At the end, we realized that they were not really sure about identification of worms. So we're not sure about that. If anyone has any problem, crop production issue, let us know. We can investigate and see if it's really because of the worms. Um, Treatments, we talked about it. How to cohabit. Yeah, so for soil health, if like in gardens, if your gardens is not close to the woods and you are in a town, maybe just keep, I don't know, mulch, but still managing the worms by picking them up, by like solarizing them. Just keep doing whatever you're doing normally for your soil. Uh, they they don't uh, they don't really change the nutrient cycle as much as they change the physical property of the soil. So physical property is really easy in a garden to work on it and make it keep the garden healthy. And what are the yeah, I think I covered those. Let's go through a few questions before we run out of time.
Do you want to, oh, there we go. So cute.
Mhm.
Right. So I'm just going to go through. Okay. So Mo asked, is it possible to get some idea of the scale of the cocoons? It's tough to tell how big they are from the images. And what I use, Mo and Maryam, maybe you have other suggestions, but I don't know if people can see this, but I have a little jar of dry yellow mustard seeds, and they're about the size of that. I think this is a good like hands-on, if you're at a doing a tabling, I think this is kind of a nice uh, size comparison that people can kind of wrap their heads around. What do you think of that, Maryam?
Yeah, I agree. That's great. And also, I think, yeah, they look like peppercorns and but smaller. So the size of the mustard seeds, but just think of a peppercorn in that size. That's usually what their size is. Um, I can tell you the sizes in millimeter. I don't know in inches, but in millimeter, the smaller species is 1.5. The second one is 2.5 millimeter, and the largest one is 3.5 millimeter. That's the size of their cocoons.
Great. So once you have jumping worms in your garden, there are questions about castings. Can you mix the castings back into the soil? And does it act as a fertilizer?
Um, it I'm not sure about that. It might. It's like that's what you buy from when you buy vermicompost. But I'm not exactly sure if the worms they add any nutrient. It's usually their body when their body breaks down. There's so much nutrient in those rather than the casting itself. But in the casting area, that means you had the worms there. You might have some dead worms that already decomposed. So it might work. It's probably not they're not a very strong fertilizer, but it could be.
Okay. We talked about the heat needed to kill the worms. I'm going to skip that one. When worms move onto fresh soil, leaving the castings behind, are they also leaving the cocoons behind?
Yes, they do.
And the cocoons are also laid in the fresh areas.
Yes, yeah. They don't lay their cocoons at one spot. It's like one at a time. So yes, that's correct.
Okay. Okay, we talked about heat. How long do cocoons remain viable in water? Like after you rinse the roots.
For years.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So we
yeah,
we recommend that you drain that water and then solarize what's left, right?
yes. Or squish them. Just walk over them. Just break the cocoons or solarize them. Yes.
Using bleach in the water. I mean, the question then becomes, what do you do with the bleach in the water?
Yeah,
So, right.
yes. And also, we don't know if the bleach penetrates enough to kill the embryo inside too. So, uh, yeah.
What diatomaceous earth? Do they have any effect on jumping?
I have not done any research on that, and I haven't seen many, but it might because it's an irritant. The only thing is for worms, they can avoid it. They can go deeper in the soil and completely avoid it. So it's one of those that could be tricky.
Yeah. Okay, the mustard water ratio. I think somebody had said a third of a cup mustard powder to a gallon of water. Does that sound right?
I think Penny knows. If Penny is here, she should know.
Okay. Penny, if
I
you
I
if
I
you can maybe just type in the chat, Penny, if you have that number. And I'm gonna just move on because we're running out of time and I want to make sure we get to um let's see.
oh I should I stopped sharing.
That's okay.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I just kind of lost track here. Okay, so we talked about getting the heat up by someone is asking about the bottom of the bag not being hot enough. So we talked about ways to raise that up, put a barrier in between the bottom of the between the soil and the bottom of the bag. Would collecting them for winter freezing work in the fall? I'm assuming collecting the worms that they freeze in the fall, but then that would work to kill the worms. They die in the cold anyway, but it wouldn't affect the cocoons, right? That's the problem.
yeah, I didn't get that question.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. Oh, that might have just been asked to me. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Right. One of the question is why don't birds eat them? There are some birds eat them, like robins, they eat them, but like I had robins in my backyard and they ate all of the worms. And then when I said that in a workshop, someone came to me and was like, I threw them at robins. They don't want to eat them. So it might be the species that you have. It might be if it's the smaller one, robins might like them better than like the big one, Haugendorfi, or they might have different personality and tastes.
Okay, if there's no known toxin in the soil, is it safe for chickens or pigs to browse on the soil with worms?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't, yeah, I don't see
Yeah,
any
I have
problem
heard
with that.
some rumors out there that that they do bioaccumulate, and so there's been some concerns about heavy metals, but if you don't have heavy metals in your soil, then they don't bioaccumulate something. That's
Yes, yeah. The earthworm species, they usually there are a lot of research of using earthworms for bioremediation of soil where there are like pollution. So if you have pollution, they might concentrate it in one spot, but if you don't have it, you should be fine.
mentioned that there are bodies decomposing and having good nutrients. So can I just chop them up and add them to the soil?
Probably yes.
But don't count on like if I know somebody said that they just to try to kill them, but that might not necessarily kill them, right?
Yeah, the head and clitoris is the part. Sometimes when they drop their tail, like if the worm is like this big, they sometimes even drop like almost half of their body, and it's still the head survives and it would produce cocoon. So yeah, if that's what you want to do, make sure you hit the head part more than the tail.
Does soap kill the cocoons?
Not sure.
Yeah.
Probably not. Yeah.
Penny did confirm a third cup mustard to a gallon of water covers about 18 square inches for flushing. Penny says, I've tried a lot of mustard flushes, and Penny has done a lot of citizen science. So she's very diligent. So thank you, Penny. She says in the end, this is not very cost effective. So thank you for that. Did I miss any cocoons for jumping worms the same size as cocoons for red wigglers? Not sure. I'm not sure. Do you know red wiggler cocoon
The
size?
size of their cocoons, they're completely different. They have a different shape. If you Google it, you will see how their cocoon looks like. They're not even like dark brown like jumping worms. They look a little transparent. They have two tips on both sides, and they're very light brown to greenish brown. So they're different. You can, if you look it up, you will find the difference.
And I think this is going to be the last one. Maryam, can you talk
Mhm.
about the clitellum? There's a question about, is it a saddle or does it go completely around circumferential? I've seen worms with a cream colored clitellum, but it is not circumferential, more saddle-like.
Yeah,
Is that a jumping?
yeah, that's a great question. I forgot to mention that it goes around their body, so there is no gap. Like there are other swarm species that their croton might be bright, light color, but it doesn't go all around the body. Like it's usually underneath. There's a little tiny gap. So, yes, it has to be all around the body.
Thank you. I think that's the last of our questions. If something does come up, just you could pop me an email and then we can start collecting them and get the information back out to you. As master gardeners, this tea seed meal, it is not labeled as a vermicide. So So we cannot recommend it at all for worms. It is a fertilizer. So just know that. So we should not be recommending that. Penny and Miriam were kind enough to let us use some of their slides. And that's the slide set that I have provided for you all. So there were a few updates that I need to make. So if you are giving a workshop or just need it for your own information, we'll be able to get that a revised version back out to you. Thank you so much, Maryam. Thank you for your ongoing research and your interest in jumping worms and helping us understand them and how they are evolving in our gardens in our worlds. And I really appreciate the time that you've taken with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer any question if I have the answer
Great.
to them.
Great. Yeah, and it sounds like we'll get the slides that you've presented. So
Sure.
we'll make sure that gets back. Great. Thank you all for coming, and have a great afternoon. Keep cool.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.